October 1966. Without prior warning, the Romanian Central Committee passed Decree 770. This catastrophic legislation enacted an absolute ban on abortion and contraception. Nicolae Ceaușescu, the cold-blooded dictator, harbored a deranged ambition to violently double the population and mass-produce an enormous army of industrial workers. He chillingly declared, "The fetus is the property of the entire society. Those who avoid having children are deserters." Reproduction was no longer a personal choice, it was forcefully mandated through state violence. Overnight, the entire nation was transformed into a massive, heavily surveilled human breeding factory. Millions of women were violently stripped of their bodily autonomy, functionally reduced to state-controlled incubators. This brutal decision was clinically calculated on paper, without a single shred of empathy or logistical consideration for the massive starvation and deep poverty already crushing the working-class families forced to breed. The horror aggressively escalated with the horrific inception of the Menstrual Police. State security agents, collaborating with coerced gynecologists, enforced humiliating, mandatory monthly examinations directly in the workplace. Women were forced to line up like cattle to clinically prove they were pregnant, or face crushing punitive taxes for failing to bear children. Cornered and desperate, countless women resorted to terrifying, back-alley abortions using knitting needles, coat hangers, and toxic roots. The state hospitals were rapidly flooded with the mutilated bodies of women bleeding to death. Secret police officers stood guard directly inside emergency operating rooms, ruthlessly denying critical medical treatment until the dying woman named the person who performed the illegal procedure. Documented casualties exceed 10,000 dead women, but the true forensic reality is far bloodier. The authoritarian regime did not care about the slaughtered mothers, they only clinically counted the babies forcefully extracted from them. Exactly as Ceaușescu's cold-blooded calculus predicted, the birth rate violently exploded. But it triggered a catastrophic disaster. Hundreds of thousands of infants were born into severely malnourished families completely incapable of feeding them. The state's clinical solution: aggressively encouraging starving parents to surrender their newborns to massive government-run orphanages. They falsely promised the children would be nurtured by the great communist state. But forensically, these massive facilities were not orphanages, they were brutal, industrialized human warehouses. Over 100,000 children were aggressively crammed into freezing, filthy concrete institutions. There was absolutely no heating, virtually no food, and a severe deficit of medical personnel. Newborns were brutally abandoned in rusting metal cribs, left to lie in their own accumulating feces and urine. An entire generation was ruthlessly stolen, functionally reduced to soulless numerical statistics in the deeply paranoid ledgers of a megalomaniacal dictatorship. When the Iron Curtain finally collapsed, Western journalists physically breached these orphanages and documented scenes straight from hell. At the Sigid facility, clinically dubbed the Camp of Death, hundreds of emaciated, completely naked children were found physically tethered to their beds. The children did not cry, because their developing brains had brutally learned that absolutely no one was coming. They repeatedly smashed their own heads against the concrete walls, rocking rhythmically in dead silence due to catastrophic sensory deprivation. Many suffered permanent muscular atrophy, staring with completely vacant eyes. The intense stench of raw ammonia and decaying tissue was suffocating. Underpaid medical staff reused a single, unsterilized hypodermic needle on dozens of infants, directly triggering a terrifying, industrialized HIV epidemic. This was not administrative negligence, this was highly systematic, institutionalized torture that permanently obliterated the neurological architecture of tens of thousands of human beings. Ceaușescu's medical infrastructure ruthlessly categorized children into three clinical classifications: recoverable, partially recoverable, and incurable. The third group, which horrifyingly included infants with minor defects like a cleft lip or a crossed eye, were officially labeled as non-productive refuse. They were violently exiled to hidden psychiatric camps buried deep in freezing forests, totally isolated from society. Here, caloric rations were systematically slashed to levels deliberately designed to induce starvation. There were absolutely no nurses, no warm clothing during the brutal -20-degree winters. The documented mortality rate spiked to a staggering 50% annually. These discarded children were intentionally left to freeze to death or die from extreme malnutrition, their skeletal remains casually dumped into unmarked, anonymous mass graves. This was a clinically executed biological purge, systematically executing completely innocent citizens purely because they failed to meet the rigid physical standards of the communist industrial machine. While tens of thousands of children were literally rotting in the dark, Ceaușescu obsessively executed another deranged vanity project. He violently bulldozed 1/5 of Bucharest's historic center, forcefully evicting 40,000 citizens from their homes, to construct the colossal palace of the parliament. It remains the heaviest administrative building on Earth, costing billions of dollars, grotesquely heavily decorated with millions of tons of crystal, solid marble, and gold. To financially fund this sprawling palace, Ceaușescu aggressively exported the country's entire agricultural and energy supply, literally starving his own citizenry. Grocery stores were totally barren, stale bread was ruthlessly rationed at starvation levels, and citizens were legally forbidden from turning on residential heating. The massive, brilliantly illuminated palace stood towering in the freezing darkness, a grotesquely opulent tomb built directly on the crushed bones and abject misery of millions of Romanian people. To strictly enforce his absolute domination, Ceaușescu massively expanded the Securitate, the most deeply ruthless secret police force in Eastern Europe. Forensic data reveals 1 in every 3 Romanians was an active informant. Intense, paralyzing paranoia infected every corner of society. Telephones were constantly wiretapped, hidden microphones were physically embedded in apartment walls, and absolutely every typewriter had to be legally registered with the police to explicitly track keystrike patterns. Citizens who merely questioned the starvation rations completely vanished in the night, violently tortured in subterranean interrogation centers. Terrified parents refused to speak honestly in front of their own children, mortified that teachers would interrogate the kids at school. An entire nation of 23 million people was heavily locked inside a massive, invisible psychological prison, where intense suspicion and creeping dread aggressively choked out every single instinct of resistance. The most chillingly grotesque irony was Ceaușescu's highly sanitized image on the global stage. Because he occasionally publicly opposed the Soviet Union, Western powers literally rolled out the red carpet for this brutal tyrant. In 1978, he rode in an open carriage with the Queen of England at Buckingham Palace, heavily drinking expensive champagne and securing massive, highly lucrative trade contracts. Declassified documentary footage exposes these highly fabricated diplomatic smiles, while simultaneously, back in his own country, the Menstrual Police were aggressively torturing pregnant women, and abandoned infants were literally consuming their own feces. The extreme, sickening hypocrisy of global geopolitics turned a completely blind eye to Ceaușescu's massive human meat grinder, explicitly empowering him to continue violently draining his nation's blood under the strict protection of both sides during the Cold War. December 1989. The heavily compressed, boiling rage of 24 years finally violently detonated. As exceedingly bloody riots erupted in Timișoara, Ceaușescu arrogantly stepped onto the palace balcony to pacify a highly coerced crowd of 100,000 citizens during a live national television broadcast. But this time, instead of the heavily orchestrated cheers, the massive crowd aggressively started booing. Historical video footage captures the exact, terrifying moment of realization freezing the dictator's face. His eyes violently widen, his mouth drops open, completely unable to clinically process the collapse of his absolute power. His psychotic arrogance shattered live on national television. Gunfire aggressively cracked through the square. The furious mob violently breached the building, hunting down the man who engineered their living hell. Ceaușescu and his deeply hated wife, Elena, frantically fled via a military helicopter directly from the roof, desperately clutching completely useless suitcases of cash. The desperate escape catastrophically failed. Exactly 3 days later, on Christmas Day, the dictatorial couple was aggressively captured and subjected to a highly brutal, improvised military tribunal lasting less than 2 hours. Raw transcripts document Ceaușescu's delusional arrogance right to the final second, aggressively screaming that he refused to recognize the court. But there was absolutely zero time for clinical mercy. With their hands violently tied behind their backs, they were roughly dragged out into a freezing courtyard, pinned against a filthy, bullet-pocked toilet block. Before they could even physically stand upright, the firing squad aggressively unloaded hundreds of AK-47 rifle rounds directly into their bodies. Raw, uncensored footage broadcast the deeply bloody corpses of the great leader collapsing in a massive pool of blood, violently terminating one of the darkest, most grotesque chapters of the 20th century. His forensic legacy. A massively traumatized nation and tens of thousands of deeply scarred, Ceaușescu's children, locked in the dark forever.